French-Americans, also called Franco-Americans, are Americans who identify themselves to be of French or French-Canadian descent. About 11.8 million U.S. residents are of French or French-Canadian descent, and about 2 million speak French at home. An additional 750,000 U.S. residents speak a French-based Creole language, according to the 2011 census. While Americans of French descent make up a substantial percentage of the American population, French-Americans arguably are less visible than other similarly sized ethnic groups. This is due in part to the high degree of assimilation among Huguenot settlers, as well as the tendency of French-American groups to identify more strongly with New World regional identities such as copyright Qua, French-Canadian, Acadian, Cajun, or Louisiana Creole. This has inhibited the development of a wider French-American identity. History. Unlike other immigrants who came to the United States of America from other countries, some French-Americans arrived prior to the founding of the United States. In many parts of the country, like the Midwest and Louisiana, they were the founders of some of these villages, cities, and first state inhabitants. While found throughout the country, French-Americans are most numerous in New England, northern New York, the Midwest, and Louisiana. French is the fourth most spoken language in the country, behind English, Spanish, and Chinese. Often, French-Americans are identified more specifically as being of French-Canadian, Cajun, or Louisiana Creole descent. An important part of French-American history is the Quebec Diaspora of the 1840s-1930s, in which 1 million French-Canadians moved to the United States, principally to the New England states, Minnesota, Wisconsin and Michigan. Historically, the French Canadians in Canada had among the highest birth rates in world history, which is why their population was large even though immigration from France was relatively low. They also moved to different regions within Canada, namely Quebec, Ontario and Manitoba. Many of the early male migrants worked in the lumber industry in both regions, and, to a lesser degree, in the burgeoning mining industry in the upper Great Lakes. Louisiana Louisiana Creole people refers to those who are descended from the colonial settlers in Louisiana, especially those of French and Spanish descent. The term is now commonly applied to individuals of mixed-race heritage. Both groups have common European heritage and share cultural ties, such as the traditional use of the French language and the continuing practice of Catholicism. In most cases, the people are related to each other. Those of mixed race also sometimes have African and Native American ancestry. As a group, the mixed-race Creoles rapidly began to acquire education, skills, businesses and property. They were overwhelmingly Catholic, spoke colonial French, and kept up many French social customs, modified by other parts of their ancestry and Louisiana culture. The free people of color married among themselves to maintain their class and social culture. The French-speaking mixed-race population came to be called Creoles of color. The Cajuns of Louisiana have a unique heritage. Their ancestors settled Acadia, in what is now the Canadian provinces of New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, and part of Maine in the 17th and early 18th centuries. In 1755, after capturing Fort Beauce in the region, the British Army forced the Acadians to either swear an oath of loyalty to the British Crown or face expulsion. Thousands refused to take the oath, causing them to be sent, penniless, to the 13 colonies to the south in what has become known as the Great Upheaval. Over the next generation, some 4,000 managed to make the long trek to Louisiana, where they began a new life. The name Cajun is a corruption of the word Acadian. Many still live in what is known as the Cajun country, where much of their colonial culture survives. French Louisiana, when it was sold by Napoleon in 1803, covered all or part of 15 current U.S. states and contained French and Canadian colonists dispersed across it, though they were most numerous in its southernmost portion. During the War of 1812, Louisiana residents of French origin took part on the American side in the Battle of New Orleans. Jean Lafitte and his Baratarians later were honored by U.S. General Andrew Jackson for their contribution to the defense of New Orleans. In Louisiana today, More than 15% of the population of the Cajun country reported in the 2000 United States Census that French was spoken at home. Another significant source of immigrants to Louisiana was Saint-Domingue, which gained its independence as the Republic of Haiti in 1804, following Haitian Revolution. Much of its white population fled during this time, often to New Orleans. Biloxi in Mississippi, and Mobile in Alabama, still contain French-American heritage since they were founded by the Canadian Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville. The Houma tribe in Louisiana still speak the same French they had been taught 300 years ago. Colonial era. In the 17th and early 18th centuries there was an influx of a few thousand Huguenots, who were Protestant refugees fleeing religious persecution in France. For nearly a century they fostered a distinctive French Protestant identity that enabled them to remain aloof from American society, but by the time of the American Revolution they had generally intermarried and merged into the larger Presbyterian community. The largest number settling in South Carolina, where the French comprised 4% of the white population in 1790. With the help of the well-organized international Huguenot community, many also moved to Virginia. In the North, Paul Revere of Boston was a prominent figure. Midwest. From the beginning of the 17th century, French Canadians explored and traveled to the region with their coureurs de bois and explorers, such as Jean Nicolet, Robert de la Salle, Jacques Marquette, Nicolas Perrot, Pierre Le Moyne d'Iberville, Antoine de la Mouth Cadillac, Pierre Duguay copyright de Bisbriant, Lucien Gaultier, Pierre Lecalada, Rena copyright Auguste Chauteau, Julien Dubuc, Pierre de Lavar copyright Rendry, and Pierre Parent. The French Canadians set up a number of villages along the waterways, including Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin; La Bay, Wisconsin; Cahokia, Illinois; Kaskaskia, Illinois; Detroit, Michigan; Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan; St. Ignace, Michigan; Vincennes, Indiana; St. Paul, Minnesota; St. Louis, Missouri; and St. Genevieve, Missouri. They also built a series of forts in the area, such as Fort de Chartres, Fort Crèvecoeur, Fort St. Louis, Fort Ouiatenon, Fort Miami, Fort St. Joseph, Fort l'Abbé, Fort de Boide, Fort St. Antoine, Fort Crèvecoeur, Fort Trempealeau, Fort Beauharnois, Fort Orleans, Fort St. Charles, Fort Kaministiquia, Fort Michilimackinac, Fort Rolla Copyright, Fort Niagara, Fort Le Boeuf, Fort Venango, and Fort Duquesne. The forts were serviced by soldiers and fur trappers who had long networks reaching through the Great Lakes back to Montreal. Sizable agricultural settlements were established in the Pays d'Illinois. The region was relinquished by France to the British in 1763 as a result of the Treaty of Paris. 3 years of war by the natives, called Pontiac's War, ensued. It became part of the province of Quebec in 1774, and was seized by the United States during the Revolution. New England, New York State. In the late 19th century, many Francophones arrived in New England from Quebec and New Brunswick to work in textile mill cities in New England. In the same period, Francophones from Quebec soon became a majority of the workers in the sawmill and logging camps in the Adirondack Mountains and their foothills. Others sought opportunities for farming and other trades such as blacksmiths in northern New York State. By the mid-20th century French-Americans comprised 30% of Maine's population. Some migrants became lumberjacks but most concentrated in industrialized areas and into enclaves known as Little Canadas. French-Canadian women saw New England as a place of opportunity and possibility where they could create economic alternatives for themselves distinct from the expectations of their farm families in Canada. By the early 20th century some saw temporary migration to the United States to work as a rite of passage and a time of self-discovery and self-reliance. Most moved permanently to the United States, using the inexpensive railroad system to visit Quebec from time to time. When these women did marry, they had fewer children with longer intervals between children than their Canadian counterparts. Some women never married, and oral accounts suggest that self-reliance and economic independence were important reasons for choosing work over marriage and motherhood. These women conformed to traditional gender ideals in order to retain their Canadian cultural identity, but they also redefined these roles in ways that provided them increased independence in their roles as wives and mothers. The French Americans became active in the Catholic Church, where they tried with little success to challenge its domination by Irish clerics. They founded such newspapers as Le Messenger and La Justice. The first hospital in Lewiston, Maine, became a reality in 1889 when the Sisters of Charity of Montreal, the Grey Nuns, opened the doors of the Asylum of Our Lady of Lourdes. This hospital was central to the Grey Nuns' mission of providing social services for Lewiston's predominantly French-Canadian mill workers. The Grey Nuns struggled to establish their institution despite meager financial resources, language barriers, and opposition from the established medical community. Immigration dwindled after World War I. The French-Canadian community in New England tried to preserve some of its cultural norms. This doctrine, like efforts to preserve Francophone culture in Quebec, became known as La Survivance. Potvin has studied the evolution of French Catholic parishes in New England. The predominantly Irish hierarchy of the 19th century was slow to recognize the need for French-language parishes. Several bishops even called for assimilation and English-language-only parochial schools. In the 20th century, a number of parochial schools for Francophone students opened, though they gradually closed toward the end of the century and a large share of the French-speaking population left the church. At the same time, the number of priests available to staff these parishes also diminished. By the 21st century, the emphasis was on retaining local reminders of French-American culture rather than on retaining the language itself. With the decline of the state's textile industry during the 1950s, the French element experienced a period of upward mobility and assimilation. This pattern of assimilation increased during the 1970s and 1980s as many Catholic organizations switched to English names and parish children entered public schools. Some parochial schools closed in the 1970s. Although some ties to its French-Canadian origins remain, the community was largely anglicized by the 1990s, moving almost completely from Canadian to American. Representative of the assimilation process was the career of singer and icon of American popular culture Rudy Vallee copyrightee. He grew up in Westbrook, Maine, and after serving in World War I attended the University of Maine, then transferred to Yale, and went on to become as a popular music star. He never forgot his Maine roots, and maintained an estate at Kezar Lake. Civil War French Americans in the Union forces were one of the most important Catholic groups present during the American Civil War. The exact number is unclear, but thousands of French Americans appear to have served in this conflict. Union forces did not keep reliable statistics concerning foreign enlistments. However, historians have estimated anywhere from 20,000 to 40,000 French Americans serving in this war. In addition to those born in the United States, many who served in the Union forces come from Canada or had resided there for several years. Canada's national anthem was written by such a soldier named Calix Salavilla copyrightee, who wrote this anthem while he served for the Union, attaining the rank of lieutenant. Leading Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard was a noted French-American from Louisiana. Politics Walker examines the voting behavior in U.S. presidential elections from 1880 to 1960, using election returns from 30 French-American communities in New England, along with sample survey data for the 1948-60 elections. From 1896 to 1924, French Americans typically supported the Republican Party because of its conservatism, emphasis on order, and advocacy of the tariff to protect the textile workers from foreign competition. In 1928, with Catholic Al Smith as the Democratic candidate, the French Americans moved over to the Democratic column and stayed there for 6 presidential elections. They formed part of the New Deal coalition. Unlike the Irish and German Catholics, very few French Americans deserted the Democratic ranks because of the foreign policy and war issues of the 1940 and 1944 campaigns. In 1952 many French Americans broke from the Democrats but returned heavily in 1960. As the ancestors of most French Americans had for the most part left France before the French Revolution, they usually prefer the fleur-de-lis to the modern French tricolor. Franco-American Day. In 2008, the state of Connecticut made June 24 Franco-American Day, recognizing French Canadians for their culture and influence on Connecticut. The states of Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont have now also held Franco-American Day festivals on June 24. Population. According to the U.S. Census Bureau of 2000, 5.3% of Americans are of French or French-Canadian ancestry. In 2013, the number of people living in the U.S. who were born in France was estimated at 129,520. French Americans made up close to, or more than, 10% of the population of 7 states, 6 in New England and Louisiana. Population-wise, California has the greatest Franco population, followed by Louisiana, while Maine has the highest by percentage.